Hey, this is Mike Wilmot, and today in SQL Shorts, I want to cover big data and Twitter. And this is actually a rendition of the project by Vu Lee on CodePlex. And Vu Lee is also a Microsoft employee and is an architect living overseas and did a fantastic job in this project. I'm just taking this project and kind of formalizing it in a presentation. But all the credit goes to Vu as far as the work he did in creating the architecture here that covers the big data from both a SQL Server side as well as a Hadoop side, and leverages tools like Stream Insight, which we'll see in a second. This is an overview of the Microsoft Big Data picture, and if you see here on the left, you can have lots of different devices that feed into the Microsoft ecosystem through tools like Stream Insight, which is a complex event processing engine. Also, you can leverage tools like Hadoop on Azure, Hadoop on Windows Server, which is coming, and then things like Parallel Data Warehouse can be a ultimate destination for things like Stream Insight and or Hadoop on Windows and or Azure. Also, this PDW instance can be a destination for tools like integration services from disparate systems. And once all the data is piped into this parallel data warehouse from things like Stream Insight, from Hadoop, and from things like SSIS, then you can have a rich reporting infrastructure that you report on that data. And you can use tools like reporting services, Performance Point, Power Pivot, third-party tools to surface that up. But this is the world of big data from a Microsoft perspective, and it's really compelling because we have all these different tools that work orthogonally in the sense that they each have their own role and responsibility, and together they create a very rich ecosystem where the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. What we're going to do today is look at that is a similar architecture, and some of the things we'll use again is a complex event processing engine, Stream Insight, to collect Twitter data. What we're going to do after that point is send those tweets from Twitter to SQL Server and Azure instance, and I have the instance name here, and then we have a database that will pipe those to, and that's going to be the high-level tweets. For more of the blob data of the tweets, the body of the data, we're going to store that in Azure blob storage. So the nice part about Azure is you've got a SQL Server store as well as a blob store. And then after that, we're going to leverage the power of Hadoop to do things like MapReduce, and we're going to send that to an instance down here called w.cloudapp.net. Once we're done with all that and processing it through things like MapReduce and Hadoop, we'll consume those through a dashboard, things like Power View or Power Pivot. And this is the actual architecture diagram from the CodePlex that I mentioned earlier, where we've got Twitter data being pulled from a complex event processing input adapter. Also, you've got a sentiment engine that's trying to determine is the sentiment about this product, this person, etc., positive, negative, or neutral. So that's the Sentiment 140 engine that's running. So once we pull the tweets into this analytics engine, we have also an output adapter from the complex event processing engine that we can take things like the high-level data, vet that into SQL Azure, the body of the data, put that into an Azure blob storage, and as well we can be doing real-time aggregation and streaming to things like a HTML5 real-time dashboard that gets sent out to, say, a Windows 8 device, an iPad. You might have a laptop or some other device, a mobile device that you're using. The alternate path from going from just a dashboard is that you can take the data that you have in SQL Azure and Azure Blob Storage. You can map that Azure Blob Storage to Hadoop on Azure as well as pull in your SQL Server high-level information, combine that into Hadoop on Azure, and then do a MapReduce jobs on that with HDFS as well. Take all that data and connect via a Hive connector to things like Power Pivot and Power View. So any one of these venues would be really interesting in terms of taking Stream Insight data and just pumping that out to a dashboard, and or taking that Stream Insight data, splitting it into header information and body information, and then putting it to Hadoop on Azure. but Vu in this case went above and beyond and wanted to show that we can do reporting from either Hadoop on Azure and or from a Stream Insight engine. Stream Insight's really nice in the sense that it's a enterprise edition feature that allows you to do complex event processing on tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of records per second, typically for things like manufacturing applications, or if we've just got a super high volume of data that's being generated each second, where traditional types of SQL Server queries just don't make as much sense as being able to run the queries near real time. We're going to go through a document that is on the CodePlex site as well that's going to do a step-by-step. And then I found this interesting article by Denny Lee, who's also a Microsoft employee, on connecting Power Pivot to Hadoop on Azure, and we'll go over that as well. So I'm going to pull this document up here in 1 second, and we're going to be able to see kind of some of the steps we'll be covering today. So if you go to the CodePlex site, what you're going to find is a bunch of documentation. Part of the documentation is going to be this document here that walks through step by step in terms of how to set this whole thing up, which steps to perform. And then there's some kind of more cryptic statements that you have to run that we're actually going to go through this whole process. And before I go through this whole process, what I want to do is kind of show the high level state of affairs here for this whole project and kind of see what the end state is. So what we're going to do at this point is we're going to show that we're going to have a certain queries that we want to make of Twitter, certain things that we're interested in. Could be Broncos football, it could be the stock market, it could be a certain product or person that you want to follow. Anything that interests you in terms of the Twitter sphere, you can pull those tags in and pull the tweets in that are relevant to that and display those, say, in a real-time dashboard. So that's going to be the first step that we're going to look at, is connecting Stream Insight via a WebSocket to a real-time dashboard. So let's go ahead and look at that first. So this is an example of the Stream Insight real-time dashboard, and what you're seeing here is I've got multiple search terms for things like Office 365, Microsoft, Windows 8, SQL Server, SharePoint. As these tweets get sent from Stream Insight to the real-time dashboard, you're seeing that there's a total tweets as well as a sentiment engine, and then you can also see the actual tweets that come through. Some are going to be positive, some are going to be negative, some are going to be neutral. But it's a nice way of getting kind of a real-time heads-up display of what's going on with related to your product, to your interests, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a really sophisticated interface that's phenomenal to kind of watch real-time and see what people are saying out in the Twitter sphere. Now behind this, there's also an application that runs in the background that is more kind of the nuts and bolts of what you're seeing on the screen. So as Stream Insight pulls these events off of the Twitter sphere, you're seeing them reflected in both the command line interface, which is actually connected via TCP/IP to this front-end dashboard. So if we had to characterize what we just saw there, we saw Twitter data being pulled into the Stream Insight engine, as well as sentiment analysis being run real-time on that data. And then also we see that all that data is being vetted out to a real-time dashboard that's flowing here. So if we're looking at this piece right here, that's what we're seeing. Now we're also expecting to see simultaneously that data is going to be sent to SQL Azure as the header info as well as the SQL blob storage. So what we're going to do now is, since we've seen this piece here, we're going to shift over to the Azure piece. So let's go ahead and look at that. So what I've got here is I've got actually SQL Server, and this Management Studio is running, it's connected to an instance of SQL Server itself. So I put the connection string in and my username and password, and I also created a database called Social. This Social has a table called Tweet Info. You can see right now, or the last time I ran this, I had 196 entries. As we're running this real-time dashboard, obviously this number is going to increase. And so This is now 215. If we run it again, it's going to be 217. So we've got all these entries, and again, this is just header information, the tweet ID, the time it was created, and the sentiment, whether it's positive, negative, or neutral, and then the topic that we're interested in. These are going to be a lot of different topics based on kind of the things that get manifested there. We can also come into our Windows Azure portal. And the nice part about Windows Azure is that you've got both things like storage accounts as well as databases involved in that. So if we looked at our database a second ago, this is a little bit different view of it. You can kind of see a time series of what's going on there. You can do things like monitor, configure, all that kind of stuff here. As well as if we look at the storage account, this gives us a sense of our storage account. We can do things like we can monitor, we can configure it, we can manage the keys, the encryption keys that we have. That's going to come in handy a little bit later. We can delete stuff here, which we don't want to do right now. We can also look at things like the containers themselves. And in this case, I have a container called VS Deploy. If I click on VS Deploy, then I get a sense of the actual detailed data for each of the tweets. So again, this will come in a little bit handy a little bit later, but for now we're just seeing that this Azure Blob storage is storing all the detailed data in this VS Deploy, which is a container underneath this storage account. Another nice tool we have at our disposal is this Cloud Explorer. The Cloud Explorer, I again can look at my Azure storage here, my Azure storage account we just looked at, where I have all the blobs stored. And I have this VS Deploy container here, and this is showing me that for this date I have all this detailed data. So it's the same thing we just saw from the website. Again, this gives us a little bit more manageability and control as far as coming in here and managing the data specifically as if it was a file explorer type thing. So again, gives you a sense of the detailed data and the text files. And then what we're going to be looking at later here is as we dive into some of the details, you'll see that there's actual field names here, things like created at, ID string, text, etc., etc. So we're going to start pulling some of these fields later as we look into this data. So up to this point, we've looked at Twitter data coming in, the sentiment status, the complex event processing engine, the real-time dashboard. We looked at SQL Azure storing the high-level data, the tweets being stored in the Azure Blob storage. Now we're going to start looking at the output from Hadoop on Azure. So the nice part about Hadoop on Azure is you can take unstructured data and you can run these map-reduce jobs on the unstructured data that allow you to take extremely large files, and for a very low cost and price point, you can take those files and you can run jobs on those files and then combine those later to produce a final output. So what we're going to look at now is a way that Excel and a tool called Power Pivot and Power View that are built into Excel now, you're able to actually connect to the cloud with this tool. So with Power Pivot, in the latest version of Excel 2013, you can actually run both Power Pivot and Power View inside of the context of Excel. So we've got geospatial information. We see that we've got a bunch of Twitter-based tables here that we can look at detailed data, as well as we've got the ability to do analysis on the data, things like followers, hashtag information, count of items created at specific hours, et cetera, et cetera. So there's lots of richness that you get from here, as well as if you want to go back to the back-end data, you can see that we pulled in a bunch of the information that we had stored in Hadoop on Azure. So I guess the question now is configuration. How do we get to a point that we can surface all this richness up? So we've looked at the Excel and the Power Pivot side. If we start talking about things like the whole flow again, we've talked about complex event processing. This time we looked at the SQL Azure and the blob storage, taking it over to Hive. And again, to do it in the Hive, the tricky part from a configuration standpoint is really getting this mapping correctly, where the keys that you have for your Azure blob storage are somehow related to your Hadoop on Azure, so these two can communicate. Also, you want to be able to pull in all your SQL Server data in here, and that's some of the secret sauce that we'll cover. So we're not going to look at configurations now, but what we just showed here is, again, Power Pivot and Power View pulling that data from Hive that was originally sourced all the way from Twitter through complex event processing, split out into SQL and blob storage, and then combined in Hadoop on Azure. So that's kind of the whole puzzle here. Right now, I'm going to start talking about configurations. So if you're just interested in kind of the high-level overview of the whole piece, this is probably where you might want to pause. And so for now, what I'm going to start doing is start diving into some of the details of how do you configure these types of things, more technical level, but there's a lot of lessons learned in terms of how I set this up, stubbing my toes and things like that. So let's start focusing now on the cookbook, the step-by-step. Again, this is all up on CodePlex, but again, some of the configurations and the steps and the nuances are significant. So let's look at those. One thing I will say is I had the advantage of starting with a virtual machine that had some of the stuff configured. If you don't, just follow the CodePlex instructions in terms of how to get the initial configuration set up, and then I'll take it from the document side. So this is the CodePlex project and this README file. The place that I'm going to start is right around this once statement. I've also set up a Hadoop on Azure account, so that's already done. If you haven't done that, that's probably something you need to do as well. But this README file is a really great place to start. It's also in the project itself. So the README file that I used in this project kind of steps through the initial getting started piece. Things like setting up Stream Insight, the WebSockets, things like that. Also, it talks about things like setting up your SQL Server Azure database. I did that by running this create Azure DB objects, and that is one of the files that is found in this other resources, at least in my project it was. So you can run that script to create all your Azure objects, and so you can go ahead and run through that. Once you're done with that, then you've got your Azure database connected. The next step that Vu talks about is the Stream Insight needing an Azure Blob storage account. So the next step is to start leveraging your Azure account if you have one, and also a tool called Cloud Explorer. That allows you to get a little more granular look at the files that you've got in your Azure Blob storage account. At this point too, you're going to start seeing references to this app settings section of this config file. I'm going to go through that in a second, but there's several things that you'll need to configure in the app.config file. When it comes to configuring the app.config file, you want to have things in this like your Twitter username, your Twitter password. You want to have the keys or keywords that you're most interested in. So per the comments, you want to use commas to separate multiple entries. You also want to have your blob storage account entered here and your account key. I zeroed mine out. It's not going to matter that much anyway, just because it's going to be deleted soon. But you also want to have like your blob container name, all the stuff that I showed you in the Cloud Explorer. So that's kind of where these fields come in, and you'll see that a little bit later. You can also come in here and add other storage accounts if you have them. And then you also want to come in and add things like your database server name, the database name itself, your username, and your password. That's all gets entered here. As well as there's several sections in the comments that talk about, or in the README file that talk about entering the IP address of your actual machine. So just follow those comments. That should be fine. So the next step is a pretty interesting one, and it's really critical, and that is that we've got to do things like map the Azure blob storage to the Hadoop on Azure. And so if I go back to our diagram here, that's the mapping right here. So you want to have these two, your blob store, be able to talk to Hadoop on Azure. If I go to my Windows Azure, I'll see in my storage area that for this storage container, I've got something down here called Manage Keys. If I click on that Manage Keys, it's going to give me my primary access key. I can copy this primary access key, and then once I have that copied, I want to go to Hadoop on Azure, and I want to go to my cluster, and I want to make sure that this has all that information. So I'm going to go to the Manage Cluster link and set up ASV, which is my Azure Blob Storage. And that's where I'm going to give it my storage account name and my passkey. Now the reason that I'm showing you this passkey and storage account name is it's going to be deleted here in a short order anyway, because it's there's like a 3-day maximum for these blob storage accounts. Again, that's super important, because if that mapping isn't created, then there's no way you're ever going to get any of your tweets moved from your Azure Blob Storage over to the Hive store. You also want to be able to remote into the Hadoop head node. So that gives you access to the head node of the whole Hadoop piece, and that's right here. You've got this ability to do remote desktop. You've also got the ability to do things like open ports, and if you're going to be able to connect via ODBC to Hadoop, you're going to have to open this port. So that's something to consider as well. When you remote into this head node, it's going to allow you to run commands like Hadoop and Hive commands on this. So that's important as well. As an aside, there's also nice samples and downloads that you get here as well, and you can see job history. This kind of shows you the whole Hadoop piece in general. So once we log into the head node on the Hadoop side of the house, and let's just kind of talk about what exactly we're doing. We're going to log on to Hadoop, the head node here, and what we're going to do is we're going to now have to figure out how do we get data from SQL Server Azure and SQL Server Azure Blob Store. How do we get that over to Hadoop on Azure so we can get that data over here, that we can do this MapReduce piece, which is really the bread and butter of Hadoop, is being able to take your data, chunk it out map it out to multiple pieces, run code on those many little pieces, and then combine that all back into a solution and an answer on unstructured data. So the first piece we'll look at is getting the SQL Server data over. So we're going to have to go to our head node to start that process. So this piece here is using this scoop command to connect to SQL Server Azure with all of our login information, the name of the table, and some other commands that we want to give it. So this is a little bit complicated in terms of getting it all right. So let's go and see if we can find an example of what worked for me. What I'm going to initially do is go over to Hadoop, and I want to go to the head node. So let's go remote desktop into that. So let's go ahead and look at remoting into the head node here. So it's w.cloudapp.net. So we're going to have to use our credentials here. Let's go ahead and put in our password. Okay. What this is doing now is giving us access to this head node. What we can see is that we've got kind of an environment where we've got things like a Hadoop command line, and we've got a bunch of different directories that have things like applications, let's see, apps, and these will be some of the directories that we'll be poking around in a little bit here. So just be apprised of that. So when I come to run this command, this scoop command, I want to connect to my database instance. I want my username at my domain, whatever password I have, and the database, the table, and some import and overwrite commands. When I run that command, then I'm going to be able to either have success or failure based on how things go. So if you get some strange failures, then you're going to know that string didn't work. If you get some pretty verbose stuff here, then you'll probably be sure that something good is happening. So this job is continuing to run. We're importing data, and it looks pretty good. So at this point, we have just pulled data from SQL Azure into our Hive store. The next thing that we're going to do now, once our scoop command is completed and we've imported our SQL data, is now we're going to pull our Azure Blob Storage data into HDFS so we can let HDFS do all its work on the HD file system. This is where we're going to leverage this analyze tweets with Hive, that text command. But before we go ahead and run that text command, we're going to have to pull in some of our Hadoop data. Now this is not going to work unless we've done the due diligence to create our mappings from Azure into Hadoop. Now if we remember, in Azure we had this W account and this VS deploy container, and that's super important because what we have to do is create a mapping so that we can connect between Azure and Hadoop. Remember that we had these managed keys here, and if we go to the Hadoop side, this W storage account is the same one here, and the keys are the same one, and the passkey is the same one in this managed keys. That's really important. But we also have to remember that there's this there's this VS deploy container that we also need to be mindful of as well. So let's keep all those three things in mind. So right now I'm in my scoop directory, and so this is now I need to change to a different directory. If I'm going to start running different commands like Hadoop commands, I need to be in a different directory like Hadoop directory. So now that I'm on the Hadoop node, I want to go to the Hadoop command line and run this Hadoop command. And the nuance here is that we're connecting to the specific container, and then we're pulling all the data into this cTwitter directory. So let's see if this works. As you can see, it doesn't look like a lot's happening here, but in the background we're starting to add text files. So that's a good sign that data is being pulled from the Azure Blob Store into our Hadoop node that we can start running our Hive commands on once that's done. If you notice in the instructions that it said this ASV Twitter because that was just a different account that Vu had, and of course you have to create the correct directory on your file system. As the files get copied over, they should match what's in our Cloud Explorer, because as remember, our Cloud Explorer was exploring what was on Azure in the WVS deploy container, and now that we're pulling it over into Hadoop, they should match. Once the Hadoop get command is run on your data, then what you want to do is run this put command. And once that's done, what you want to do is you want to run this analyze tweets with hive.txt file. You want to run that in the context of your Hive directory. Here's a screenshot I took of it. I went to the Hive directory and I renamed it to just hive.txt. And I commented out this first line of the text file in the project. And what I did, this is for yesterday's data actually, but what I did is I created this external table partitioned, and then I partitioned it by date. So you can use a similar design pattern if you're interested in doing that. But that file is this analyze tweets with Hive. So again, a lot of these helper files are really nice, whether it's creating database objects or even things like the Excel files in both Power Pivot 2010 and 2013. And obviously this logical diagram is really nice in terms of being able to see the logical layout of the entire project, the thing that I've been showing the whole time. So great diagram that Vu made. So once the data has been processed in Hive with our text file, the one I called hive.txt, or this analyze one, same thing, that generates a series of Hive tables. Now the final step is once we've got these Hive tables, what we have to do is do something meaningful with them, like pull them into Power Pivot and Power View. And that is done with this Hive ODBC driver. So I found this interesting article by Denny Lee about, and here's the URL if you want it. You can just Bing search it and find it. But this is a way to kind of walk through the steps of setting up your a file DSN that allows you to connect from Excel to Hadoop. And it walks you through all the pieces and parts on how to set up that file DSN. Once that file DSN is set up, then all you have to do is connect from Power Pivot into your Hadoop, and then you can actually start creating some of the Power Pivots and Power Views that we saw in Excel 2013. Now, once that file DSN is created, we can also always just go back to existing connections to view that, but it's in this Hadoop on Azure connection. If you look at the one I set up, you can just go to your control panel. There's this setup for ODBC files, and you've got this file DSN. Here's the Hadoop on Azure one, and you can see I have the host name, username, password. That sets up the file DSN. And then if you come into Power Pivot and you want to get external data, you could always say, let's see, from other data source, and this is where we want to grab ODBC. We want to build this thing out. And if we look at our data source names, we've got our Hive connections that we've created. So you can leverage that file DSN to grab Hive data, pull it into Power Pivot, and you should be good to go. And actually, probably the best way to grab that file DSN is to grab this second option here, and that's where you can pull the file DSN as well. So lots of different options here. You definitely want to make sure you, if needed, you enter username, password, allow saving it, and then enter your catalog, which will probably be default. So hopefully this gives you a down and dirty look at the entire process. Again, what we really wanted to stress is the fact that big data is vetted out into lots of different pieces and parts, and leveraging all the different components of the Microsoft SQL Server stack is critical, so that each component does its share of the work in its own unique way. And again, what we did today is we took the vast volumes of Twitter data out there, and we filtered it by the things that we cared about. We looked at a sentiment indicator. As we took it into our input adapter, we can run analytics on it, obviously within the context of the Stream Insight engine. As that data comes out, we can send it either directly to a dashboard that can be sent to a mobile device or say a Surface device, as well as if we want to take that data and split out the tweets into high level and low level information, detail information. That can be split out to things like SQL Azure and Azure Blob Storage. That then can be pulled into Hadoop on Azure, given the correct mappings and permissions to things like Scoop and Hive and Hadoop. We can get that data pulled in and surfaced into tools like Power Pivot and Power View. It's a sophisticated layout. Again, Vu Lee did a fantastic job on this, and hopefully it's a great design pattern for you and your constituents to use to really get the best scale and the best value from your Microsoft investment. Again, this is Mike Wilmot, and feel free to contact me if you have any questions about this stuff, and Vu as well. If you have any questions about the documents as well, that should be in the deck here. And have a great day. Take care.